Hey there, greetings everybody. I want to welcome you here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So we're here with an episode of Ranking the Albums, episode number 6, I believe. Episode number 6. But before we get started with episode number 6, we'll give you a little bit of explanation what we do here. So basically, one of my subscribers, a friend of mine, Ben, he gives me 4 albums from his vast collection, which dwarfs mine. And I listen to the 4 albums, and then I rank them basically according to how I like. The one that ranks number 1 goes on to the semifinals at the end of this tournament, or whatever you want to call it. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different, because last week when I did the ranking of the albums, I had an album in there I had confused with the album that he wished me to do. So I gave that album he wished me to do a listen, and then I'm going to add it to the last week's ranking. So I listened to the entire album today. The album is Avery, their debut album. I had some other band in there by mistake. It was completely not thought about. I didn't think about it. I thought it was the right band, but I was wrong. So he gave me the right one. I listened to it today, and it wasn't bad. Kind of a little synopsis on it. So it was kind of a hard rock band with some keyboards in it, but a lot of poppy stuff at times as well. You got the vocals were a little bit more mainstream, male vocals in this one instead of females, which is what it was supposed to be. And overall, it wasn't too bad. I liked it better than the one that I had picked by mistake, but it still finished last. Didn't make up the ground necessary to make any dents on the previous album. So it would have finished last behind Bill Ward, who was number 1 with his Ward 1 All the Way. Frank Marino was second with Power of Rock and Roll. Nazareth was third with the Expect No Mercy, and then Avery's debut album finished 4th. So that corrects the mistake I made. I do apologize for that, but there was no real changes ultimately in the outcome. But it was worth trying something different and getting it right this time. Okay, so the next challenge, which takes place tonight, episode 6, we have again 4 more albums by 4 more bands. So and I put these according to how he gave them to me. I'll talk about the albums and then I'll give my rankings at the end. That's pretty much what I've been doing so far for this particular series. So we've got Crimson Glory and their self-titled album, ELO and El Dorado, Gary Moore and his Dirty Fingers album, and then Ian Gillan, or just Gillan is the name of the band, and Double Trouble is the name of the album. So we'll talk a little bit. We'll start with the Crimson Glory self-titled album. This was they had this kind of almost a horror feel to the movie. It was almost like a horror movie feel to the album. A little bit of that creepy stuff going on that you get with Alice Cooper as well. So it was much heavier than Alice Cooper, though, I think. So it had a little bit of both of those elements in it, which I think added a kind of a memorable part to the album, to be honest with you. Screechy, high vocals, high vocal pitches at times. Some heavy, ripping guitars, I guess you might want to call it that. High-end, heavy sounds throughout the album. I thought this was a very strong album. It started out, I didn't like it initially. After the first song, I was thinking, this is not going to go anywhere, but I kept an open mind, and the album kept growing and growing. And by the end of the album, I liked it quite a bit. It was a pretty solid album. The next album out, of course, is ELO's El Dorado. So I will say right off the bat, I'm not a huge ELO fan. I don't dislike them. In fact, I almost don't think about them too much at all. The only time I think about ELO is like, I have a few bands like this where I only think about them when I'm actually doing something like this. So the El Dorado album I was not familiar with. So I listened to it. I found the vocals very similar at times to Bob Dylan. I felt every time I would hear them, it would just remind me of Bob Dylan. I'm not a huge Bob Dylan fan. I don't hate the vocals or anything, just not a big fan of it. The tracks were driven by more orchestral sounds, which is pretty normal, I think, for Emerson. I always want to say Emerson. I don't know why. It's Electric Light Orchestra. Yeah, it's a little bit bombastic in the pop region of the galaxy, I think. Kind of a radio-friendly pop album with a lot of orchestral sounds to it. Not a terrible album by any stretch, but not something that's terrible in memory. Maybe if I listen to it more, it might grow on me, but I think it might more likely go the other way. The next album up was Gary Moore's Dirty Fingers. So now I have not listened to any Gary Moore albums in their entirety. I have listened to a few songs off of him, but not his entire album. There are some absolutely killer riffing guitars and guitar solos on this album. As you might expect, he's pretty solid guitar player, no doubt about it. Maybe underrated too, I think. The vocals were very high pitched, like a high end pitch noise. He did the Nuclear Attack. I guess he wrote the song, so he had it on his album, even though Greg Lake also had it on his album a couple of years prior to this one. But still, some ripping guitar on that as well. Lots of, the guy has a gift for that guitar ripping sound. Almost a John Sykes-like feel to his guitar in some ways, maybe even more so, I think. So yeah, excellent album. Dirty Fingers, it's called. The last album that he gave me was Gillan, Ian Gillan to be specific, but the group is called Gillan, and the album is called Double Trouble. Some heavy kind of rock sounds going on here, well within that same similar range as Deep Purple. I have found a lot of similarities there, mostly because of his vocals. Those vocals are typical, a lot of screaming, a lot of fantastic. I don't think of him as a screecher. That title might go to some other musicians, but to him, I think of him more as a screamer. Some more reflective-like tracks, like Born to Kill, which had some nice piano and some melodic, heavy parts to that song as well. So a little bit of mix of everything on that particular track. So he mixed it up a bit. It was a pretty solid album, I found. Nothing really stood out to me as being great, and nothing really stood out to me as being terrible. It was all pretty much average plus, and pretty solid album from Ian Gillan. So now it's time to rank these albums. I didn't write the numbers on here, so I'm just going to write them on here for my future references when I'm doing it, but on the board I have them. So coming in at number 4 was going to be ELO. I suspected that might be the case before I did the 4 albums, and it turned out to be exactly what I thought. I just find this stuff not in my wheelhouse at all. Really doesn't interest me. I've never really liked their music. There's a little bit of that Bob Dylan on this stuff, a little bit more than you've got on some of the later stuff. As they went along right up to Discovery, I like them best on Discovery. There's a couple other albums in there I don't mind as well, but this one just, to me, was just terribly not memorable, so it's going to come last. The number 3 album, I'm going to give this to Gillan. I thought the album was pretty good. The musicianship was pretty strong. Of course, Ian Gillan's voice is among the best in rock, at least at that time anyways. And I thought the tracks were pretty solid. I like the fact that he mixed it up a bit. I thought it was pretty good. However, nothing terribly memorable on the album. Nothing stood out to me as being fantastic. But then nothing really stood out to me, period, really. It was just a solid album with maybe after 2 or 3 listens to it, I might find 1 or 2 tracks on there I liked quite a bit. But for this time, because I only have the 1 listen to it, it didn't really impress me overly, but it wasn't bad at all. So this is going to come in at number 3. Number 2 was Gary Moore. A little surprising. I knew he was going to be heavy, but it was heavier than I even thought. I thought the album was heavier than I would have thought. His guitar playing, of course, is really great. I think he's a bit underrated in that area. I found the vocalist very high pitched, though. He was extremely high pitched. I don't even know I don't think it was him. He probably had a musician on it. I don't own the album, and I didn't look online to see who it was. I just was listening to it. And yeah, there's a couple of tracks on here I thought were really well done. Some ripping guitar solos too. Just if you just like that ripping guitar solos, this album is gonna be a big player for you. So yeah, I gave him just a nudge over Gillan for the second spot. And that leaves number 1 to go to Crimson Glory, which I think, to be honest, I don't think it was much of a competition for them. They started out kind of weak for me, but then grew quite exponentially after the first track, which I didn't really warm up to. But once I got used to their sound, I really started to like them quite a bit. They have a lot of unique sounds to them too, with that creepy stuff going on, the kind of horror movie-like flavor to their music, but also ripping metal. This is definitely a metal band, no doubt about it, to me. This is a band I think that deserves to get a little bit more listen to, so they're going to go on to the semifinals here, I think fairly handily. I don't think there was much of a challenge from the other 3, which is kind of funny because the other 3 I was somewhat familiar with, but this band I'd never heard of. Maybe that was to their advantage here on this particular episode. So anyways, there you have it, my pick for ranking the albums. I'll give them to you now in the order of top to bottom, descending. So Crimson Glory finished first with their self-titled album. Gary Moore finished second with his Dirty Fingers album. Ian Gillan finished third with his Double Trouble album. And last and least, ELO's Eldorado finished fourth. Kind of a distant fourth, I think. They didn't fail. They got a passing mark, but just not really close to the other 3. And the top album, I think, kind of went away with it a bit. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Ranking the Albums. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons. That's much appreciated. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss next week's ranking of the albums. This was episode 6, so we have 2 more before we get to the, I guess we would call it the playoffs, the semifinals. So, and don't forget to leave your comments in the comment section below. And I will see you next week on Ranking the Albums. So have yourself a good night, take care, and goodbye.